So there's something changed in the middle of the 20th century. And that change hasn't yet been effectively assimilated by our leaders. And so the second sort of main point of that I would make is that soft power successfully deployed doesn't necessarily produce a victorious political outcome, but that it has a much stronger record than does hard power realism. And it's much less costly in lives, in resources, in everything. And what makes it work are two things. One is gaining the high moral ground. And the way that the high moral ground was achieved after World War II was essentially the discrediting of colonialism and the affirming of the right of self-determination, an idea that really was born through Woodrow Wilson in this country, but was meant in a narrow way initially, but it was an idea that spread very powerfully and gave rise to nationalism throughout the non-Western world. And it was the absence of nationalism that really allowed the empires to be established. And of course, it's one of the ironies of this modern history is that it was the colonial powers that taught either in their own universities or in the schools within the colonies themselves, they taught the ideas of nationalism. And you have various learning experiences that what happened was that this sense of the invulnerability of the side with this better military technology was suddenly shown to be not altogether compelling. There's a famous anecdote about Nehru that he knew, the moment he knew that the British Empire was vulnerable was when the Japanese defeated the Russians in the War of 1904 and 1905. Because that was the first time Russia was viewed from the Asian perspective as a European power. And it was the first time that he sensed this vulnerability. And of course, lots of things had to happen for that vulnerability to be translated into a political outcome. But what I'm suggesting is that this combination of gaining the high moral ground plus the dissemination of a nationalist ideology that became a very powerful mobilizing force really shifted the balance of forces in this soft power direction. And there's a third context that reinforces this way of thinking, and that comes out of several experiences. One of them is the Gandhian victory in India, but another is the anti-apartheid movement that succeeded in overthrowing or transforming a very militarily and paramilitarily strong and brutal regime in South Africa. I was there just a couple of years before Mandela was released from jail, and no one expected a change in South Africa except through a bloody civil war. And what happened that allowed the peaceful transformation to occur was a global, expanding the battlefield from South Africa to the world. The anti-apartheid campaign, which was a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, with the backing of the United Nations, giving it in my terminology, a legitimacy, and even inducing very conservative leaders in Britain and the United States to impose sanctions on South Africa. Ronald Reagan was our president, and Margaret Thatcher was the British president. Both of them were rather comfortable with a strategic relationship with South Africa. There were heavy American and British investments, and yet grassroots politics sufficiently discredited the apartheid system and made it appear to be a form of unacceptable behavior in the late 20th century. And it led to the effective isolation of South Africa and various soft power consequences, soft power costs. And this produced these events that you can only explain in retrospect. No one anticipated them. Namely, the release of Mandela, the peaceful transformation of South Africa into a multiracial constitutional democracy. And that, to me, is the essence of what I mean by a legitimacy war. That war was not won by the anti-apartheid forces engaging the South African military or the South African police or security forces. It was won in this non-territorial global symbolic battlefield where the anti-apartheid forces sufficiently dominated the high moral ground to be able to deploy these soft power instruments very effectively. I've been trying to suggest recently that the Palestinians are now very much pursuing a strategy similar to what was pursued by the anti-apartheid movement on a global scale. And that the Israelis are, in an extreme way, or in an exaggerated way, reproducing the same hard power realist errors that have characterized U.S. foreign policy in recent decades. But because they're engaged directly with an adversary that has a great deal of perseverance and a great deal of sympathy around its own region and in the world, it's had to resort to more and more vicious tactics in order to try to create stability. See, it was one thing when it was fighting its neighbors. These were governments, and they were trying to challenge Israel on hard power, on a hard power term. And there, Israel was very successful, and they created the impression, for themselves above all, that they had the will and capacity to dominate any adversary. But it's one thing to use military power against a foreign state, especially when you're defending your own territory. It's another thing to use it against an internal adversary that is seeking its own self-determination and its own human rights. And for a long time, Israel had at least a good portion of this high moral ground. They had the imprimatur of being a democracy. They had the sympathy of lots of countries